In this video, we have discussed everything you need to know about JavaScript functions. Even the nitty-gritty things that no one explains. For example, why do we need functions in the first place and the benefit of using functions, etc. and etc. Hi all, welcome to the complete JavaScript beginners tutorial by CodAffection. First of all, let me ask you a favor. If you find this video helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't yet. And please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues. Functions are one of the fundamental building blocks in JavaScript. If you like JavaScript functions and the flexibility it offers, I can guarantee you that you will end up loving the language JavaScript. Let's get started with following code snippet and let's find out why functions are awesome. Now, suppose we have three variables a, b, and c. Now, we are going to divide these numbers here. First of all, we will divide a with b. So I will have this log statement here and let's do the operation here, a divided by b. Now I'm gonna divide a with c. So 8 divided by 2, which is 4. Now let me copy this and pasting here. Here we are going to divide b with c. So here we have the result after dividing 3 by 2. Now you just realized from looking at these various outputs here, we can really know what are these outputs here. So I will just format these outputs here with string concatenation. So I will be using the string templates like this. A, so here we have the string interpolation. A divided by b gives this output here. Now you could really understand what is this output means. Now I will do the same for rest of these outputs here. So I will just copy this and pasting here for rest of the operations. So a divided by c, which gives this output, and then b divided by c gives this output. Now somehow you find out another problem that you might have when dividing a number with 0. For example, let's assign this b with 0, then this output will be infinity. If you want to prevent that from happening, you have to check the denominator before the division operation. So we will check that with this if statement here. If b is equal to 0, then we will just print this denominator is 0, so division is not possible. Else we will do the division operation. See, so this is what we are doing here. Now you might have this problem for other division operations also. So I will just copy this if else statement from here and pasting for other operations and changing these variables accordingly. Now if you pass 0 as a denominator for any of these division operations, then it will print this message denominator is 0, so division is not possible. Now here we have done the same division operation with multiple variables separately like this, and thereby we are repeating the same steps at different places of this program. Repetition of code is not at all a good idea because of various reasons. For example, if you want to change the steps involved in this operation, you have to make the change at different places. Suppose you want to replace this 0 number with 0 word, you have to do that separately in places where you repeated the same step or code. It will become more frustrating than you can imagine when you have a big application. In order to prevent this from happening, we developers follow a principle called DRIVE principle, which is an abbreviation for don't repeat yourself. I will show you how JavaScript functions solve this problem and what are the other benefits of using JavaScript functions. Now I will just copy these code snippets from here and let's copy that into another file so that we can refer that after replacing these codes with functions. So I will just paste the code into this file here. Now back to the previous JavaScript file. First of all, I will start with function definition. Function is a set of instructions to perform a particular task or an action. And this is how the syntax for defining a function looks like. First of all, we have the keyword function followed by a function name and then a pair of parentheses. Within that we can pass values, or you could say parameters. We will discuss them in a bit. And then we have a code block. Inside that we can have multiple statements for the function. Now let's try to define a function here for this division operation. So here we have the function keyword and then name of the function, which is divide. And for this function, we can define variables like this, number1 and number2. And these are called as parameters of a function. Through these variables, we can pass values into this function. And then here we have the curly brace. Within that, we can provide the statements of this function. So everything in between these curly brace is called as body of this function. Now let me complete this function for dividing two numbers, num1 and num2. First of all, I will check whether the denominator is 0 or not. So num2, which is what we are expecting as a denominator for this division operation. So if num2 is equal to 0, then we will print this message here. Else, we will do the division operation. For that, I will copy paste this statement from here. Num1 divided by num2. And let's do the division here. Num1 divided by num2. There are other ways to define functions in JavaScript. This way of defining a function is called function declaration or function statement. From now onwards, if you want to divide two numbers, you can use this function divide here. Let me show you that here. We will just call the function divide like this, divide a, comma, b. And then finally we will put a semicolon here. See, here we are dividing the number a with b. Same is accomplished with this function divide here. So we don't need these quotes here. Let me remove that. So this is what we call calling a function or invoking a function. Sometimes it may also refer as running a function or executing a function. So this is how we invoke a function. First of all, we have the function name and then a pair of parentheses like this. Within that, we can pass the values for these variables. So these are called as parameters of a function. And the values that we pass into this function, these a and b, are called as arguments. So these are arguments of the divide function and these are parameters of this function. And these arguments are assigned to these parameters here in the same order, meaning the first argument is assigned to the first parameter and the second argument is assigned to this second parameter here. So that's how a function invocation works. If you only define a function like this function declaration here, it won't make any code. The function will be only executed by JavaScript engine if you call the function or invoke the function like this. Now let me replace these codes here with the same function divide. Divide a with c. Let's call the same function for this division operation also. Divide b with c. Now we have defined the function up above. Now you can reuse this function as much as you want. If you want to divide 8 with 4, you could do this. And here we have the output. So here the function is defined once and reused multiple times. Now let's discuss why functions are super helpful. For that, first of all, I will open these codes and the previous code side by side. Now here I have already opened this common practice file. Now let's open this copied code side by side. For that, just hold Alt on your keyboard, then click on this file here. So here we have the code snippet with function and without function. So the first reason why functions are super helpful is that they are defined once and they can be reused multiple times. And thereby we could achieve more with less code, as you can see here. And also that proves my next point. Since we are not repeating codes with functions, it is easy to modify a function. Suppose you want to end this message with a period or dot, you just need to make the change here and then the same change will be reflected wherever you invoke the function. If we were not using function, we have to make the modifications at each repetitions here. So if there is a change of procedure for doing this operation, we only need to make the modification within this function definition here, and the same modifications or updation will be reflected wherever we invoke the function. So that is more convenient and it helps us to save times in future development. Now there is one more benefit of using functions. Suppose we have a variable full name and let's assign that here. If you want to convert characters inside this string to uppercase, you just need to call the function to uppercase. If you want to change all of the characters inside the string to lowercase, you can just call this function to lowercase. So here we have the output through those two functions to uppercase and lowercase. Here these two functions gives abstractions to what is happening behind the scene. So function gives abstraction, which means we don't have to know what is happening behind the scene, what are the steps involved in these functions. Here we can just ignore the complexity of steps involved in this function. Instead we can just think of what actually this function does in brief. So once a function is defined, we can invoke the function whenever it is necessary without thinking what is happening behind the scene. So hope you are convinced that functions are super helpful. Now let's talk about parameters here. We already learned that values that we pass into a function is called as arguments, and the variables that access those arguments are called as parameters. Here we have two parameters, num1 and num2. These parameters can only be accessed within this function here. And also, if you look at the function syntax, you can't see a semicolon at the end of this function. If you look at the output dev console here, we are not getting any error by putting a semicolon here, but it's not recommended to put a semicolon at the end of a function declaration. As a general rule of thumb, it is recommended to end all statements in JavaScript with semicolon, except block statements. A block statement is something that group multiple statements with a pair of curly brackets like this. See, here we have a block statement. It is not recommended to end the block statement with a semicolon. Same in case of this function also. If you end a statement with a closing brace, it's not recommended to follow that with a semicolon. We have seen the same with if statements also. It's not recommended to put a semicolon after this if statement. Same in case of switch statements also. So as per the syntax, it's not recommended to put a semicolon after a block statement or curly brace like this. But there is an exception. We will see that in a bit. Now let me get rid of these codes here. I want to talk about default parameters. For that, I will be defining a function to calculate total price per item and quantity. To save the total price, I will declare a variable total price. For this calculation, we just need to multiply price per item with quantity. Finally, we will just print this total price like this. Total price is equal to, just concat the variable total price here. So here we have the function declaration. A function declaration itself won't do anything or execute anything inside the program. We have to invoke the function when necessary. Suppose we bought 3 notebooks which cost around 39.55 cents. So we will call this function like this, calculate total price. Now let's pass this total price per item 3, which is the quantity here. So this function receives the first argument with this first parameter, and this 3 will be accepted through this parameter quantity. Inside the function, both of them are multiplied and the result is printed with this log statement here. You can call this function whenever it is necessary. Suppose you bought a pen also which costs around $5. Then we call this function calculate total price like this. Price per item is $5 and then the quantity will be 1. So here we have the output. See, here I just forgot to add a space before this total price here. So I will just do the modification inside the function and the same changes will be reflected wherever we call the function. Now let's talk about default value of a parameter. Here these parameters values are passed from these function invocations here. Instead of that, we can also provide the default value like this, directly assigning the default value within the function declaration itself along with the parameter with this assignment operator. So from now onwards, if quantity of the item is 1, we don't have to pass the value here. It will use this default value here. If there is no default value assigned and we are not passing the value for the second parameter, we will get the output as NaN, meaning we are not assigning a value to this parameter. It's like an unassigned variable. So all unassigned variables has the value undefined. So when we multiply that with price per item, we will get this output NaN, not a number. If there is a default value, we can avoid these situations also. So that's how a default value of a parameter works. Now let's talk about function expression and anonymous function. As per the function syntax itself, you could see that we need to provide a function name after the keyword function. So it is not allowed to define a function without a function name like this. You could already see the red squiggly line here, and inside this dev console you could see the error message here. Function statements requires a function name. But it is possible to define functions without names when you assign that function to a variable like this. Let sum is equal to function. So here we have the function without a function name. So functions without a function name is called as anonymous functions in JavaScript. You already know when we assign a value to a variable like this, the right side of the assignment operator is always an expression. So here in this case, after this assignment operator, we have a function. So this function is in place of an expression here. So this function is also called as function expression. When a function is passed in place where JavaScript is expecting an expression, then that function is called as function expression. That's what we have here. It is recommended to put a semicolon after function expressions when they end a statement like this statement here. We are passing this function where JavaScript expects an expression. So this is a function expression. So let me complete this function here. This function is expected to have two parameters, and inside this function we will just add these two parameters a and b. So this function expression works exactly similar to this function declaration here, with few differences. We will get into that in a bit. Now to call this function, we can make use of this variable here, sum, and let's call this function with a pair of parentheses like this. Here we have the first value 3, 4. So 3 plus 4, which is 7. Since we are assigning a function to a variable, there is a chance of changing this variable to a different value like this. We can assign this variable with some value 6 here. Now if you call this function again somewhere expecting sum is a function, then you will get this error, sum is not a function. So normally when we assign a function expression to a variable like this, instead of using let variables, we use constant variables, and thereby it's not allowed to change the value of this sum variable, and that's how most of the time we assign function expression to a variable using constant keywords. When necessary, you can also assign functions to let variables also when you want to change the function to a different function. But most of the time, function expressions are assigned to a constant variable to prevent the variable from changing its value. So this is a function expression and this is a function declaration. Now let's check the differences. So first of all, function declarations are hoisted. We have already seen what is meant by hoisting in this session where we discussed var, let and const keywords. What I really meant by that, we can access this function before defining the function. If I cut these two function calls here and let's paste that about this function declaration, it will still works. You see, here we have the same output as before. So it is possible to invoke a function even before defining the function because function declarations are hoisted, like var variables. But it's not possible with function declaration. Let me move this function declaration up above. Even before defining the function, I will get this error, cannot access sum before initialization. So that's the main difference between function declaration and function expression. Function declarations are hoisted but not function expression. We can only invoke this function after defining the function here. In future sessions, we will see some situations but function expressions are more appropriate than function declarations. For now, that's enough with the comparison between function declaration and function expression. Generally, I prefer calling a function after defining the function. So I will just move these function invocations after defining the function up above here. Now let me get rid of these here. Let's convert this function declaration to a function expression. So I will do this. We will convert this function name as a variable like this, function. So here we have the function expression, and which is assigned to this variable here. So in the rest of the code, we can treat this variable as a function. Now let's talk about return statement in a function. To show you how return statement works, I'm gonna define one more function here. You could see this output from the function calculate total price. Generally, in amount, we only expect 2 digits after the decimal point. So I'm gonna define a function to do the format operation. So I'll be using this function expression here, format amount function. For this function, we only have one variable, which is amount, and here we have the function body. We have already discussed this function to fixed under number functions. I'll be using the same function for formatting this amount here. So we could do this. I'll just print the output here, amount, and let's call the function to fixed. We only need 2 digits after decimal points, so I will pass 2 here. Now let's call the function inside this function here, format amount, and let's pass total price here. See, here we have the output from this function call here. Instead of printing the formatted amount inside this function, we need that amount for rest of the statements inside this function here. So instead of logging that amount here, we just need to return that like this. We will use this keyword return. So this function returns the amount back to this function here. Now instead of passing total price inside this concatenation operation, we could pass the formatted amount. For that, we just need to call the function inside this log statement here. See? So return statement in a function allows us for further operations on the function output. Otherwise, it will be lost after the function invocation. So that's how a return statement works. Now if there is no return statement inside a function, then that function invocation like this here will return the value undefined. If you want to check that, let's call that within a log statement, and thereby we could see the value returned from the function. Calculate total price, and let's pass some amount here. See, we have called this function. Within the function, we have printed the amount 6 into 1, which is the default quantity. Here we have the output from this log statement here, which is undefined. So function without a return statement always returns undefined. Now there is one more thing I want to talk about. Suppose we have a function. I will give a random name like ABC, and here we have the function. Inside the function, we have this log statement. Inside that, I will just print this 1, and let me duplicate this few times here. Now let's call the function here ABC. Through this function call here, we are printing 1 on each line. Now if I put a return keyword like this function only executed this log statement here, because early return statement in a function will ignore execution of following statements like this. Here we only have the keyword return, and let's check what actually this function returns. So I will just move this function call to this log statement. So when we put a return statement without a value, it actually returns undefined. Even if we return a value here, the rest of the statement's execution will be ignored. We will get the return value from the function through this function call, as you can see here. So that's how return statement works. Now finally, I want to show you the type of a function. Let's try type of operator on these functions here. Calculate total price. So here we have the output function as an output for this type of operator. All functions comes under the data type object. All functions are object of a class function in JavaScript. Don't freak out if you don't know what is a class. We will discuss that under object-oriented programming in JavaScript. So in terms of data type, function comes under object data type. So that's all about this session. In next video, we'll be discussing arrow functions in JavaScript. So once again, if you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel CodAffection if you haven't yet. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues. See you in next video.